it's such a basic tale of being cautious while traveling alone, that you would not be able to find any culture which doesn't have it. So in China, in Europe, and everywhere in the world, when you find an ancient culture, you're going to find an ancient version of Red Riding Hood. That means that it goes back 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 years prior to men traveling out into the world and forming the various tribes that now define the nations that we see in our modern world. And that to me is very interesting because that means that there's something contained within the stories that transcends culture, transcends territories and boundaries, and it makes these tales very human. And that's the thing that I really enjoy about them.
Hmm. I can see that. They're very iconic. They sort of have those like archetypal people that you're talking about.
Hmm.
Um, Alice Madness Returns. You spoke a little bit about being kind of recruited to do another one of the Twisted Fairy Tales. The sequel, the idea for the sequel, was there a reason to go that direction? What was the inspiration for that?
So the Alice stories are following a pretty classic hero's journey, which if you look for a modern example, you might see something like The Matrix,
Mm.
where the three films are broken into the hero overcoming three distinct sections of resistance within themselves. So in the first Alice game and in the first Matrix film, there's an awakening of and a power derived from overcoming the psychological, the internal, the mental space. And so you see that at the end of both stories, there's a sort of blossoming and awareness of power within the mind. And that would be in the Matrix films. It would be within the Matrix. Suddenly, Neo has the power to take off and fly. And for Alice, it's with the resolution of her conflict at the end of the first game. It's the ability to reshape Wonderland back to the way that it was before this conflict began. With the second Alice game, it was the external, it was the physical, and so it was her being able to use this newfound mental psychological power to impact the real world outside. And that was the same thing you saw in like a Matrix film. And then the third is one where the hero combines the two pieces together. So that's where if we ever made a third Alice film, the idea that she could take her psychological power and then use that in the real world and to travel into other people's wonderlands, into their minds, and to have impact upon their lives, that would be the next chapter, and it would head towards a kind of resolution and fulfillment of her hero's journey.
Do you think we'll see that?
That's up to EA. They own the IP and control it 100%. If I could convince them to make it tomorrow, I would. But they are EA, and they kind of make their decisions at their own pace.
Okay. Well, let's hope.
Yeah, sure.
I like the Vorpal blade in the second one, and the combat is very unexpected. I felt because you have this sort of almost like in the Wizard of Oz, kind of dark, almost like sepia toned beginning, and then you go into the Wonderland area, and everything's suddenly bright and colorful, almost as shocking as when you're in Wizard of Oz, and you suddenly see Technicolor, and then this little like she's kind of small and somewhat cute, although angsty. Suddenly she has this sword in her hand. It's like attacking things. I really like the idea of the Vorpal blade. And I understand this kind of came from one of the Jabberwocky poems or something in the book. How many things in the game are directly tied to the Lewis Carroll book, and how many are things that you guys just kind of felt were Alice speaking to you?
Well, this is again going back to the rules that we had about the origin of and the presentation of ideas inside of Wonderland, because again, the mental landscape has to be defined by her life up to the point where we're joining her in the journey. And so when I look at the books and the character that we know in the books, I've always considered her to be the Alice that we are engaged with, but that at some point, basically when I burned down her family's home, right? I mean, when we made the creative decision to burn down her house and to kill her family, we broke the timeline so that we now have the Alice that we know in the game, and we have the Alice that continues off in the real world. So those are two different universes. And obviously the games are taking place in the burnt down house, dead family universe, but the past remains the same. The connection to the books is still there. And so, in order for everything to hold together and to make sense, we do have to honor who she was prior to the fire. And that means that we do have to go into the books and try to be as true as we can to who those characters were, who they could become, what they represent, the types of things that Alice would or would not experience or see in Wonderland, and so forth and so on.
Okay. It seems as though there are a lot of things, and I know you've spoken about, this being like a kind of running theme throughout history, but there seems like there have been a lot of things inspired by this game, or maybe inspired that have inspired the game. I would say Sucker Punch reminds me an awful lot of this game, like the movie and just the tone and the kind of feel of it. And I understand that Return to Wonderland by Xenoscope, which is a comic, maybe happened before the game, but there's some similarities there too, in the sense that Alice has a certain like darkness to her, a certain look. Why do you think, I guess, people are interested in seeing more of the mental sort of dark side of Alice, rather than looking at it as more of a child's kind of tale? What is the appeal of the dark side?
Well, this is what I was saying before about one of the things that's been really nice in working with this core concept is that there's something that's so clearly very natural about it. In that sense, it's not like it's my idea that we make a darker, twisted version. If it were my idea alone and it were that unusual, I think it would be difficult to get people to come together around it and to make a cohesive product about it. And I've seen that. I've seen that problem with other game ideas in our own studio or inside of other game studios where the initial idea doesn't resonate naturally with enough people for them to come together and work as a team to produce something that the audience then looks at and says, I get this. This totally makes sense, right? So the why, I'm not sure, why in general we are attracted to things like violence or the darker side of things, other than our minds tend to find violent subject matter more sticky, the same way that we find sexual subject matter more sticky. I mean, there are just some things about the way our brains evolved that will naturally pull us towards darker presentation, a more violent or visceral presentation, or more sexual presentation. So in a way, I think what we're looking at here is that these things all tap into the same systems within our brains. It's the same reason for why these fairy tales have lasted as long as they have and why they all have a dark edge. Because when you tell a story with the dark edge, it tends to be more memorable. It tends to push more of our buttons than, say, the same tale told without the darker elements.
People like twisty problems, I guess, and if it's worse, the worse it is, the more we like it.
Well, but even like you look at a Pixar film, right, which I think, on the surface in their advertising for Finding Nemo, for a Toy Story or something like that, you're thinking this is a pretty light and happy family tale, but the reality is in a Toy Story, there's some pretty dark stuff going on. The kid who's abusing the toys, the neighbor bully who's blowing them up with fireworks. I mean, he's awful and he's demonic. And the same thing when you go and look at Finding Nemo. I mean, the beginning of the story and the loss of the family and the things that the characters have to go through they're horrible trials. I mean, if you were to take that and to put it into the real world, right, you couldn't stand to watch it. If you found that little boy was killing other children the way he was killing toys, the movie would never make it into the theater. So the beauty of something like a Pixar film is that they can take extremely dark and really scary concepts like that and present it in a way that we can swallow it and still make sense of it.
I never thought of it like that, but that's very true. If you saw it down in written word, you probably would have a much different reaction than seeing it with cute little characters.
Well, Pixar films are like Tarantino movies for kids, right? So I mean, it's the same idea when you're making, a game that you can either go full bore, constant violence, constant blood and guts, or you can try to find a way to take really mature, really scary themes and wrap them in a narrative and wrap them in a story that makes sense, that has contrast, that has ups and downs, because that's what makes it human. That's what makes it something that we can talk about and that resonates with us, because our experience in normal life is one that's up and down. Some days are good, some days are bad. I think one of the bad things, the sad things about games that are like some of the bigger first-person shooters is there's very little contrast in the stories that are
Mm,
being told. It's just war and it's just violence. And I think that when we do that, it really limits the size of the audience that can find something interesting inside of that because it's appealing to just kind of one note.
I agree. Let's move to Akanero, which I believe means matter red in Japanese. I don't know if that's the case. It's been said that this is inspired by Little Red Riding Hood, and I have to say I've played somewhat of the beta, and for me, I don't know that I saw that other than the fact that there are like dead wolves in it and possibilities of wearing a cloak. Is this true, and what would be the intention of that inspiration?
Well, it actually came first from a book called The Lost Wolves of Japan, which details the history of the genocide, of the decimation of wolves in Japan, especially in northern Japan, but throughout all of Japan. So over 100 years ago, Western cattlemen went into Japan, which at that point was predominantly a Buddhist nation and that was vegetarian as well. Everybody in Japan on the island was vegetarian. And they introduced the concept of meat consumption. They fed meat to the emperor, who then gave them his blessing to go and to build cattle farms. And what they didn't think about were the external factors, the nature, and things being in balance. So what ended up happening was the cattlemen had to run a propaganda campaign and then start a war against the indigenous life, the flora and fauna, like the wolves, and eventually wipe all of them out. And so it's this really awesome and horrible man versus nature story where, as is usually the case, nature loses. And, to this day, I mean, you're still seeing the repercussions of that. But the most obvious one is that there are no more indigenous wolves in Japan. And so my thought was taking that more recent history and combining it with the concept of the wolf as a bad guy, which we all know, that all the way back to our childhood. The most famous story of that is Red Riding Hood, and using that as a platform to explore this tension between man and nature and the necessity for balance. So what we have in Akinero is really a kind of allegory for the necessity for balance. This is a world in which some really terrible things have happened, and in effect, they've opened the gates to hell. These actions of wiping out the wolves have created such an imbalance in the real world that now you've had to call in these hunters who are going to try to put the demons back in the box after we've opened the box and threatened to destroy our entire planet.
I haven't gotten quite that far, but I'm looking forward to it.
Well, that's the subtext. A lot of the story is not yet in there because it's a game that, we released it online and we're going to continue to improve it and make additions to it. And stuff like the narrative is actually something that if you play the game today, you won't see a lot of this. There are some brief comic book panels and some dialogue that's displayed on screen inside the game, but the deeper aspects of the narrative like this, I think, are going to have to come in future updates.
The idea of the story and the fact that the protagonist is a woman is pretty rare to see, a strong female lead in many of your games. Alice is an example, and now this as well. Why is that you've chosen to go that direction? It's very unusual and welcome, actually.
So I do feel like our industry, sort of rewards the repetition of certain things that work. Those being, action games with big, brawny, muscular guys toting machine guns and rocket launchers, and that not enough is done to explore outside the boundaries. And so one of the things is simply a desire to create content that pushes the boundaries, that helps to make sure that we still have other kind of ideas being expressed and that it doesn't all go towards, muscly guys with machine guns. I think some of that comes out of the fact that I did spend so many years at id Software, and that was a studio that was very much focused on first-person shooters and big meaty main characters with rocket launchers. That I was burnt out on it. That was a very simple thing. But I think beyond that, the other part of it is that the idea of expressing emotion and exploring deeper narrative, I think you tend to get people in a more receptive state of mind when it comes to things like that, when you shake up their expectations about where the game is set, who the main character is. This is not to say that women necessarily are a better vehicle for telling an engaging story. It's just that if we replace